The Golden Paladin is a faith and strength build hybrid that leverages the buffs to Marika's Hammer and the aspects of the Crucible incantations for solid damage, solid buffs, solid healing, and just generally a solid build to take into the DLC. Let's go! Let me know what other builds you'd like in the comments down below. Marika's Hammer. Now, this was pretty lacking at launch, considering it's basically the final weapon you get in the game. Hammers in general, I think, just personal opinion, were pretty lacking at launch and still kind of are in some respects, especially because of their short size. Like in terms of their range, you weren't really able to use them in a way that felt really effective when there was just like better alternatives and basically all things that you could consider using them for. This has changed a little bit though. In patch 1.8, the speed and distance of some of the attacks have been increased and the recovery time has actually been reduced. While the poise damage has been reduced in a way to sort of mitigate the extra benefits you get from the extra speed and distance of these attacks, it's still quite solid poise damage. Now, Marika's Hammer specifically, the Ash of War Goldbreaker actually got buffed twice. In patch 1.07, it got its attack power increased, and in 1.09, it reduced the recovery time. So not only is this hammer faster and covers more distance, the Ash of War does more damage and it takes less time to recover from. So realistically, this weapon is now quite solid, and I wanted to focus on a build using this weapon because it sort of makes sense a little bit. It's very thematic for going into the DLC using Marika's Hammer. So this build specifically is an evolution of my old Reaper and Stalwart Knight builds. If you remember those builds from eons ago, this is sort of a hybrid of those two concepts brought together. Now, building on those concepts to develop like a better endgame version, leveraging to these buffs, like Marika's Hammer does scale best with strength. So when you're looking at your stats here, strength should be your primary, then followed by faith, and then vigor and endurance are obviously good as well. In like any build, make sure you've got heaps of vigor as you go into the DLC, and then dexterity, pretty much don't really need that, and then mind you need for some of that FP here. But with this build, what's different about the playstyle is that because you have a big old shield, if you're not great at dodging, this gives you a different play style of blocking rather than dodging. Because our shield has like 100% negation for the most part, we can then avoid some of that damage that's actually coming towards us rather than having to dodge with the iframes. You can just hold up that shield. It's a little bit easier. You will still take a little bit of chip damage, but if we've got a lot of vigor here, it's not too much of a big deal. So the equipment for this build is Marika's Hammer as your main weapon and using Goldbreaker as its Ash of War. Now, this weapon comes extremely late in the game, right? You won't really be using this in the DLC unless you're in like a new game plus or you've obviously beaten the game in general. So just a couple of alternatives here, like say if you don't want to go that far on say a new journey, you could use the Coated Sword, which has a great like unblockable blade, Ash of War, similar but like different, like same but different. Golden Epitaph isn't bad. I don't really like the Ash of War here, but it's also a holy weapon you could use. Or like alternatively, right, you can just grab a generic weapon and put like a lightning or say like a sacred Ash of War combo on it, like even something like Sacred Blade that gives you that holy damage, and you can then switch it to lightning, say if enemies are resistant to holy, what have you, but you've got those options in there. For your shield, any shield that is of 100% damage negation is fine. I'm using the Golden Beast Crest shield just because I like the aesthetic of it. It sort of fits this build and it is a great shield, so you got that better protection in that way. Now your armor here, I'm wearing the Crucible Tree set because it does allow me to get above that 51 poise mark, and it does have decent resistances. It also fits thematically in this build. You can wear whatever you want as long as you've got a decent amount of poise. Now you really do want to hit that 51 plus poise for this build specifically because of Goldbreaker in the Ash of War, right? Like if you are triggering that effect where you've got that wind up where you're in the air, you will often take damage just because the wind up's quite long, and if you get knocked out of that, then you've just like obviously taken damage, wasted that whole time. Having that enough poise to actually tank that hit is really important. For your talismans, Shard of Alexander is great here to increase the attack power of those skills. Carrion Filigree Crest to reduce the FP usage of the Goldbreaker, and then physical damage negation from Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman is fantastic as well. I also like the Curved Sword Talisman here to enhance your guard counters, which we will definitely be using, though you've got some other alternative talisman choices you could go if you choose. For your Ash of War and your spells, we've already talked about Goldbreaker a lot, so we won't cover it again here, but those spells you're using using the Flame Grant Me Strength for the physical damage increase here, as well as the fire damage. Like if you're using the aspect of the Crucible Breath, which is a fire attack, which is great in AoE situations as well. Like highly would recommend that for any of those scenarios. Obviously you've got the AoE of Goldbreaker, but it gives you fire damage, an alternative way to deal damage, plus you get the benefits of Flame Grant Me Strength. Golden Vow is also great to boost your attack power and your defenses as well. And then the other aspects I'm using as well, like Horns and Tails, I'm using occasionally, but for the most part here, you only really have to rely on the buffs you get from them and then just leaning into your weapon. Like that's really the kind of core focus of this build. Now, some tips for playing this build. One thing that I will sort of mention here is like the purpose of this whole build series is to prepare you with DLC ready builds. Now, something to note that in the current game, like the end game of Elden Ring, holy damage is one of the worst. Like Marika's hammer does deal holy damage, which is part of the reason why this hammer has always sort of struggled, because most of the late game enemies have some sort of resistance to holy damage. We have no idea if this is going to be the same for the DLC or not, right? If it is going to be the same, which personally I highly doubt, wouldn't make necessarily sense in terms of like thematically, if all the late game enemies like just across the board, including in the DLC, all have holy damage resistance. I feel like the enemies will most likely have some sort of magic resistance to do with, you know, Saint Trina and sleeping and that sort of thing. That's just a personal opinion. Don't sue me if it's wrong, but you know, I don't think that that'll be the case. If it is the case, like we've already touched on some weapon alternatives, lightning damage is something to lean into as an alternative here, like all the lightning incantations or other incantations you can use, because you do have a lot of faith. You've got those options and you can easily switch out to different weapons with this sort of build setup. Guard counters are fantastic to lean into with this build, not only because then you can block that damage and then follow up with those attacks, but the amount of stance damage you get from guard counters is significantly higher than like normal sort of attacks, especially with hammers that do have a solid amount of stance damage. So you can often break with those lower enemies or weaker enemy stances to then follow up with a simple critical hit to finish them off. It will happen quite often. Now, Goldbreaker is fantastic because it does lift you off the ground as well. So if you have certain boss encounters or just enemies that deal like ground damage that typically like you could jump over, right? Like if you weren't going to roll it, you could actually use Goldbreaker to lift yourself in the air to avoid that damage and then slam yourself down and follow up with the attack that it does actually do. So it's just a thing to think about as an alternative way to avoid some of those attacks while allowing that window of that wind up time to use it in that way. For your Physique Flask and your Crystal Tears, I really would just be like buffing your holy attack damage here with like Holy Shrouding Cracked Tear or the Faith Not Crystal Tear to boost your faith, something like that. Even the Strength one isn't bad here because Strength is good for Marika's hammer. You got that option there. You could run something else, it's entirely up to you, but the tears here aren't so critical compared to some like other build setups. And the Great Rune's a little bit similar here. Like Radahn's Great Rune for HP, FP, and stamina isn't bad, but I'd probably lean into Godric's Great Rune because of all the attribute increase you get from that, right? Because you get the extra damage from, say, having that extra strength and faith. You get that tiny little bit of extra damage, and then you do get. So you've got those options there that you can sort of run for this build. But let me know what you think in the comments down below, what you would change, maybe some different incantations you would add. I'd love to see those notes in the comments below. But thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.